Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on the Chinese Revolution area of study 2. In this video I am going to look at the 100 Flowers campaign, which was launched by Mao Zedong and the CCP in 1956 and ended in 1957. It had a number of aims. So the first major one was to gain the support of intellectuals within China, because Mao Zedong realized that in order to create a modern industrialized economy, you needed educated workers, and in order to have educated workers you needed a good education system and the support of the intellectuals. The other major aim you can see there was to make the CCP more responsive to popular sentiment, and this aim was in relation to protests that had occurred against the communist regimes in Hungary and Poland in 1956. Mao believed those protests and uprisings had occurred because the Hungarian and Polish leaders had not allowed for people to air their grievances. So all people were able to do then in response in Hungary and Poland was to try to overthrow the governments there. Mao didn't want that to happen, so he believed that by allowing the 100 Flowers campaign to occur, it would give an opportunity for the people in China to air their grievances, to criticise in particular the party, not him, because he was the great helmsman, and then once these people had aired their grievances, then they would support the party even more, and it would increase the party's authority within China. The timeline. So when you're studying the 100 Flowers campaign, we need to understand that, or understand the events that occurred prior to the 100 Flowers campaign, in particular these mass campaigns, the early mass campaigns such as the Thought Reform campaign, the San Fan and the Wu Fan, and even the Fan Shen. All of these campaigns had targeted and attacked certain groups and classes who were seen as reactionary or bad elements within Chinese society at that time. For example, capitalists or Kuomintang supporters or landlords. The Thought Reform campaign itself it tried to rectify intellectuals, rectify their thoughts so that they were more supportive of the CCP. And the 100 Flowers was a further attempt to achieve this. So you can see there with the timeline, it began with a speech given by Liu Dingyi, who was the head of the Central Committee's propaganda department, on behalf of Mao Zedong at a meeting of intellectuals in May 1956. And it's in this speech where the very famous line, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend," first appeared. And it's in the speech that Liu Dingyi, on behalf of Mao Zedong, called for the people to air their views of the CCP and its leadership. And as I just spoke about before, referred to, so people were afraid to share their opinions initially because of the persecutions that had occurred during these early campaigns, the San Fan, the Wu Fan, the Thought Reform campaign. Other communist leaders, apart from Mao Zedong, such as Peng Zhen, the mayor of Beijing, who was an ally of Liu Shaoqi, they actually tried to dampen this campaign because they were afraid of what would happen to the party. They were afraid that the party's authority within China would be diminished. So for a number of months, nobody said anything. And Mao then decided, well, he better re-energise his campaign so that people did start to air their grievances. So he gave a speech to the members of the Supreme State Conference on the 27th of February in 1957. And the speech was entitled "On the Correct Handling of Contradictions," which stated that debate and criticism were positive things in contrast to class conflict, as they helped to achieve a greater consensus in a post-capitalist/socialist society. And it was related to the Maoist concept of unity, criticism, unity. So a contradiction in Maoist terms was a disagreement within the working class. Okay, it wasn't a disagreement between the working class and a disagreement between the working class and capitalists, because that was class struggle. A contradiction was a disagreement within a class itself. And it was a positive thing from a Maoist perspective, because people can have disagreements, workers can have disagreements about how policy should occur within society. And Mao believed it was a good thing for people to discuss, disagree, air their grievances, and then through this discussion process, they would then be unified because they'd come to a similar viewpoint. I've actually got here over the side, in this little side window here, just an excerpt from this very famous speech on the correct handling of contradictions. And Mao wrote, "This democratic method of resolving contradictions among the people was epitomised in 1942 in the formula unity, criticism, unity. To elaborate, it means starting from the desire for unity, resolving contradictions through criticism or struggle, and arriving at a new unity on a new basis." So the workers are unified, there's some disagreements, they discuss them, there's some criticism and so forth, they discuss them, and then once discussed, they come to a common understanding of the right revolutionary action or theory, whatever it may be. In our experience, this is the correct method of resolving contradictions among the people. So Mao gave his speech and he hoped to re-energise the whole 100 Flowers campaign, and he certainly did. After this speech, people did start to criticise a number of things within society. And what they did was, you can see there, they criticised the party, the leadership, and even Mao Zedong himself. CCP officials were accused of being no better than corrupt GMD bureaucrats or imperial mandarins, and Mao was criticised for his arbitrary and reckless character. For Mao Zedong, this was a shock. He did not expect to be targeted himself. He believed he was the great helmsman, the spokesman for the people. He believed the party itself needed to be improved, but not him. What did he do in response? The consequences were, he started the Antiwriters Campaign on the 8th of June 1957, and it started with the publication of his very famous On the Correct Handling of Contradiction speech, and it was published on the 19th of June 1957 in the People's Daily, but it was edited, and there were a few things that were added into it. And the things that were added were, you can see there, in which he added this idea of antagonistic contradictions. And he defined those as bourgeois and that they needed to be struggled against. So, those people who had criticised the party or who had criticised him, those criticisms were now antagonistic contradictions, and they were capitalist, they were reactionary, and those people who had made them needed to be rectified. And in the window down here, I'll just bring it up, that is a speech Mao Zedong made at the start of the Anti-Writers Campaign, and I'll just go through it very quickly. Let the professors make speeches and let the students respond freely. Better, let the reactionary professors, lecturers, assistants and students spew out their venom and speak without any inhibitions. They are the best teachers. When the opportune moment arrives, lose no time in organising separate meetings of party and league members to sort out the criticisms. Accept those criticisms that are constructive and correct mistakes and shortcomings, but refute those criticisms that are destructive. At the same time, organise some non-party people to make speeches and state the correct views. Then have a responsible party cadre who enjoys prestige make a summing up speech that is both analytical and convincing to effect a complete change in the atmosphere. If all goes well, a month or so will see the whole process through, and we can then switch to the inner party rectification, which will proceed like a gentle breeze and a mild rain. So Mao is setting out the method for the Antiwriters Campaign to follow. Okay, so further consequences. Once this Antiwriters Campaign went into full swing, intellectual institutions such as universities were attacked, and they were required to identify 5% of their staff as rightists. And if the institution didn't do this, then its leadership was suspected of rightist leanings. So if a vice-chancellor of a university did not nominate 5% of his or her lecturers as rightists, then the vice-chancellor himself or herself would then be suspected of being a rightist, a reactionary, and would be attacked themselves and probably sent out to the laogai to be rectified. Tens of thousands of academics and students suffered harsh denunciations and were put through struggle sessions. In 1961, Mao claimed 400,000 rightists had been uncovered during the anti-rightist campaign. So that's your key stat there. 400,000, according to Mao himself, of these people suffered during the 100 Flowers campaign. And many of these were sent to the laogai, the labour camps, to suffer harsh, to undergo harsh labour and rectification. Many of them spent decades in these camps. And finally, people learnt, the final consequence of the 100 Flowers campaign, people learnt once again not to criticise Mao or the CCP. So they've been given lesson after lesson. Don't criticise the CCP, do not criticise Mao Zedong. And as a consequence, people were so afraid to say anything against what the CCP were doing or what Mao Zedong was doing, that they allowed the tragedies like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution to occur. Because to speak out against these policies would be to then to bring the target down on yourself, and then you would suffer in the laogai or worse. Okay, let's get into a couple of historical interpretations now. So I've got two here. The first is by Jonathan Themby and the second is by Jun Chang and John Halliday. So the historical debate about the 100 Flowers campaign is whether Mao Zedong had always planned to trap intellectuals, or whether he'd only decided to attack the intellectuals once they had made these criticisms, once they had surprised him with how critical they were both of the party and of him in particular. So firstly, we will have a look at Jonathan Themby's interpretation. So he writes, Mao's original speech was finally printed, but with appropriate corrections by the author to make it appear that it had all been a trap laid for opponents of the regime, designed to lure out the snakes and poisonous weeds of reaction so that they could be destroyed. So Themby's arguing that Mao had not from the start set this as a trap. It was only later events which made him do this. Since his original encouragement for debate could not be wiped from the slate, the whole thing had to be turned on its head to provide fresh proof of the leader's wisdom and dedication to the revolution. The chairman initially put the number of rightists uncovered at between 50,000 and 60,000. Then he raised this to 300,000, and finally, in a remark in 1961, to 400,000. A third of them were ordinary intellectuals, such as primary school teachers, he added. And there's the stat that I used before, the 400,000. And the second historical interpretation from Jung Chang and John Halliday, so this contrasting one. Few guessed that Mao was setting a trap and that he was inviting people to speak out so that he could then use what they said as an excuse to victimise them. So Jun Chang and John Halliday are arguing that all along Mao had planned to do this. He had set a trap. It was the whole purpose of the 100 Flowers campaign, to find those intellectuals who did not support the CCP or him. Mao's targets were intellectuals and the educated, the people most likely to speak up. After taking power, Mao's policy had been to give them a generally better standard of living than the average. Those who were well known or useful were given special privileges, but Mao had them put through the grinder several times, not least with thought reform, which he himself described as brainwashing. Some foreigners say our thought reform is brainwashing. I think that's right. It is exactly brainwashing. In fact, even the fearsome term brainwashing does not conjure up the mental anguish of the process, which bent and twisted people's minds. Now Mao was planning to persecute the educated en masse. So that is our two historical interpretations for the 100 Flowers campaign. I hope you have found this video on this key event useful for your understanding of the Chinese Revolution, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.